Today, we want to share with you the story of one of the most well thought out and planned slave insurrections in the 19th century. Okay? Many of us think we got to go back 10,000 years to understand what type of warriors we were. But we just skip all over the 19th century, the 17th century, the 16th century, the 18th century. We skip all over those centuries. But we had some serious, hardcore revolutionaries that fought for black liberation. Fought, bled, died, and killed for black liberation. All right? So you've heard about Harriet Tubman. You've heard about Nat Turner. And those of you that are really revolutionary or conscious, you've heard about Denmark Vesey. But not many of us know too much about Denmark Vesey. So today, we want to go into the book, Slave Insurrections, 1800 to 1865, in the United States. The author is Joseph Cephas Carroll. All right? And this book was published by Dover African American Books. Okay? So we want to go into the book beginning on page 89. And we want to tell you about Denmark Vesey, who was the general of this movement. But Denmark Vesey didn't work on his own. See, when you hear about Harriet Tubman, you think of an individual. All right? When you hear about Nat Turner, even though he had somewhat of a small army, you're thinking about an individual. But when you talk about Denmark Vesey, you can't talk about Denmark Vesey without talking about Peter Poyas. You can't talk about Denmark Vesey without talking about Gullah Jack. So we're going to begin reading on page 89. And it says, for 4 years or more, Denmark Vesey worked with the patience of a scientist and the passion of a prophet. Now, we're reading this because we need you to understand the importance of secrecy as it relates to your work in black liberation. Yakahu calls it impu, the language of the Asatayu. Impu, the secret. Okay? It goes on to say that in secrecy, the work of insurrection and revolution went forward. The slaves were at their best in conduct, so as to avoid suspicion of any kind. Then Vesey gave up his work as carpenter and devoted his full time to the work at hand. It was Denmark Vesey's purpose to initiate an insurrection that would do nothing less than totally annihilate white supremacy in Charleston. All right? But Denmark Vesey did not work on his own. We'll get to that a little later. One eyewitness of the events, a native African chief named Zamba, who was later a slave in South Carolina, says that the leaders of the conspiracy were mostly men of talent and education who in any other country would have been hailed as patriots. They were brave to the point of desperation. Many with the hangman's rope around their neck dared to speak to their fellow slaves, exhorting them never to cease revolting until freedom came. No habitual drunkard nor talkative person was to be admitted to the organization, and no women were allowed to share the precious secrets, not, however, because of mistrust, but because these bold conspirators had counted the cost. They knew if the plan failed, there was no other alternative but death. Hence, they left the women out of the order so that they might care for the children. How many were involved in the insurrection? Nobody really knows. But it's estimated that between 3,000 and 9,000 were involved. Now, one of the leaders of this insurrection was Peter Poyas. And Peter Poyas did not trust house Negroes.
There was two kinds of slaves. There was the house Negro and the field Negro. The house Negro, they lived in the house with master. They dressed pretty good. They ate good because they ate his food, because he left. They lived in the attic or the basement, but still they lived near their master. And they loved their master more than the master loved himself. They would give their life to save their master's house quicker than the master would.
So Peter Poyas advised an agent, again, not trusting the house slave, advised an agent whom he commissioned to enlist men. He said, don't mention it to these waiting men who receive presents and gifts and goodies from their masters, or they will betray us. Okay? The third person that was a leader. Remember, we have Denmark Vesey, who's a leader. We have Peter Poyas. And the third person that I'll mention, because there's a whole group of folks, was Gullah Jack. You've heard of the Gullah Geechee Nation down in Florida. Big ups to the Gullah Geechee Nation. We're talking about being independents. They are a good example of black independence right here in the United States.
Gullah and Geechee both are people. They are ethnic groups of people. In the Gullah Geechee Nation, we are one group of people from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. So our nation encompasses all of what are called the Sea Islands and 30 to 35 miles inland to the St. Johns River.
We were all these different tribes that spoke different languages. And so since we needed to communicate with each other to figure out, how are we going to figure our way out of this? One group isn't going to do it alone. So then we came up with, I like to call a common language. Gullah is a common language so that all of these different tribes can speak. You have some of us are descendants of Ashantes, Fulanis, Bassa, Kru, Mende, Malenke, Gizi, Kizi. So, we're really like about, depending on who you're speaking to, anywhere from maybe 15 to 20 different tribes. Some are Igbos, but we needed to speak to each other, so that was really Gullah. That's the language that we came up with. And like I said, between the Middle Passages and being on the Sea Islands, that's when we kind of created this new culture.
You see that this family tree is a traditional West African family tree. It is human bodies intertwined. So we're always inextricably tied to one another. We can never be separated from one another. In 1739, due to the Stono Rebellion that took place in South Carolina, one of the largest planned insurrections, as they call it, of African people, you had a man named Cato. They wrote of him called Jemmy, who was an Angolan, who led the Stono Rebellion. Cato got some 20 plus Angolan men to make their drums again, make their weaponry, and they started marching. And all accounts say they were marching, beating the drums, saying, "Liberty! Liberty! Liberty!" There was a scare, as they call it, through the colonies that caused them to say, well, you know what? We need laws against this. We can't have the Africans reading or writing. We can't have them playing the drum. We can't have them owning land.
Then there was Gullah Jack, the native African physician, necromancer, or sorcerer. He was known among the people as the little man who could not be shot or captured. Not only was he able to work charms to the extent of rendering his own person invulnerable, but he could even impart the same power to others. If anybody tells you to give up your indigenous spirituality, you tell them the Daku said,
"Kiss my entire ass."
Okay, let's go on. We need to find out how this insurrection failed. Remember, we're talking about the importance of the secret. Thus, Black Revolution without boundaries. Okay? That's the organization that we created a few years ago. It's not that the other organizations are not good. They're great and they inspire us all the time. In fact, there may be people involved in Black Liberation Without Boundaries that are members of the other organization. Okay? It's an anonymous group. But again, why did one of the greatest slave rebellions of the 19th century fail? We're going to go to page 97 to show you and explain to you why it failed. Confidential slave Vesey-The strolled down the wharf after doing errands for his master, enjoying a bit of leisure, which house servants, house slaves, house Negroes were accustomed to. Vesey-The was approached by William, another slave. William drew closer to Vesey-The and in a serious tone inquired if Vesey-The knew that something was about to happen. Vesey-The confessed his ignorance of anything more important than a family dinner. Then William, still serious, told him that something more important was pending. He said that we are determined to shake off our bondage, and for that purpose we stand on a good foundation. He invited Vesey-The to become a part of the organization to help destroy white supremacy in Charleston. But this was too much for Vesey-The, for his genius was culinary, not revolutionary. He now proved that Peter Poyas' distrust of house Negroes was well-founded. He said that he was satisfied with his condition as a slave and found an excuse to break away from William.
And if you came to the house Negro and said, let's run away, let's escape, let's separate, that house Negro would look at you and say, man, you crazy. What you mean separate? Where is there a better house than this? Where can I wear better clothes than this? Where can I eat better food than this? That was that house Negro.
He went at once to a free colored man. So you got to be careful of these house Negroes and these so-called free Negroes that have integrated into white supremacy and are agents of white supremacy. He went at once to a free black man named Pinsell, with whom he shared the startling news and whose advice he sought. Mr. Pinsell, his advice was that he should inform his mistress and young master immediately of what he had heard. This Vesey-The lost no time in doing, and 5 days later, when his slave master returned from the country, the secret was at once revealed to his master. Within 2 hours of the fact had been related to Hamilton, the mayor of the city. Hamilton summoned the corporation of the city, and by 5 o'clock, May 30th, 1822, Vesey-The and William had been arrested and were under examination. Vesey-The, the fool that snitched, was arrested. Can you imagine that? Here you are, the white man's Negro, agent of white supremacy, and they don't even trust you. You get arrested and put on trial. Okay? But it was Vesey-The's testimony that thwarted this most well-planned out slave insurrection that had thousands of people ready to put an end to white supremacy in Charleston. Why do you need to keep your revolutionary moves a secret? Even sometimes from the person that you're sharing a bed with. Because even that person, we surrounded by house slaves. Okay? So even though you may be planning an insurrection, you got to recognize your spouse and your mate for who they are, what they are. All right, they ain't got to hide. In fact, they can't even hide because most of them ain't conscious. So even if they wanted to hide, you know a fake conscious person when you see one. Agent of white supremacy, Ray Higgins. You know that because they may be able to spit some knowledge, but at the end of the day, they're going to defend, as is their job to do, the interests of white supremacy. So if you get a chance, get the book Slave Insurrection so you can read about Denmark Vesey, Peter Poyas, and Gullah Jack. These are important figures in our history because they sacrificed everything and they were willing to fight, bleed, and die and kill for black redemption. This has been Daku Akabo Wa Akatu.